your dad was a pilot.
Right.
You were also a pilot?
Correct.
C-130 pilot. Is there a connection between those two facts?
Well, yeah, I mean, he was my hero, my idol, I guess, really. Even though I didn't know him, I mean, I was like not quite 6 months old when he was killed.
Yeah.
So I only knew him through what people, mostly relatives told me and what my mom told me.
You were 6 months old when your dad died in the Second World War.
Right.
What was his job? Let's just put it that
Well,
way.
he was a P-47 pilot. He was a fighter pilot, flew single seat, single engine airplane, built by Republic Aviation.
Yeah. And your dad went missing.
Right.
And so we'll talk about that, and then we'll talk about the recovery. Before you made the connection to the recovery project at the University of Wisconsin. So let's go to 1975. You're flying missions in and out of Saigon as South Vietnam is in the process of collapsing. At that time, what did you know about what had happened to your dad?
Okay. My family tree is very kind of like a gnarled bush, really, because my dad's family, there were his mom and dad had both been widowed and had children, and then when they married, they had my father and my Uncle John, who recently passed away, and so one of my uncles on my grandfather's side, one of his sons, also named Fazekas, last name Fazekas, was in the military, was in the New Jersey Air Guard. And he tried to get information on what had happened to my dad. And I came back, I still have the documents. The government sent us a document with a photograph of a military cemetery in the Ardennes, and which I subsequently visited while I was on active duty. But along with the picture is there's it's an overhead shot, shows all these crosses and all the burial markers. And on a wall is names of about 400 people, 400 service people, and my dad's name was on this wall. Some of the cemetery or some of the markers had names on them. They knew. So at that point, let's see. So yeah, okay. So I didn't visit the cemetery until after 75. So up to that point, what we were led to believe was that my father was buried in this cemetery in Belgium, and that that's kind of what we knew. I had documents from my mom. She had gotten the standard telegram saying that he was missing, and then later another one saying that he was assumed that he had perished, and there was a copy of a missing pilot's report that was made by his wingman, one of his wingmen, and it was only like four sentences, basically. It basically said the airplane was seen to leave formation, go into a descending spiral, crash and explode, and that was about it. That was all we knew.
Wow.
Up until the point when the University of Wisconsin contacted me. So up till then, that's all we knew.
And your assumption was that your dad's remains had been recovered and
Yeah,
were
we
actually
assumed.
buried?
Yeah, we assumed that they had been recovered, and uh, you know, we didn't really know the details of mechanism of that happening, but we assumed that that's why he was in fact, I did, as I said, when I was on active duty, we had a TDY mission to England, and I had a weekend off, and I went over to Belgium, and I went to the cemetery, and I found my father's name on the wall, and I spoke to a gentleman there that it was in some kind of, he looked like he was official person. I assumed the caretaker of the cemetery, and I asked him. I says, "How do you know?" I said, "My father's name." He said, "All these markers, so many of them have names." And I said, "There's these 400 that are on a wall." I said, "How do you know my father is here?" And they said, "Well, we know he's here, but we don't know exactly which spot." And that's so
Uh,
again, I kind of affirmed that idea that you know, that he was there.
yeah,
And it wasn't until later that I found out, after the recovery and everything, that his name was on that wall as someone who was missing, but it didn't mean that he was in that cemetery.
okay. But your assumption up until the time you were contacted by the recovery project was that his remains were there. You just didn't know specifically where, but you knew the general place.
Right.
And so you had visited that place before.
Mhm.
Um, let me back up. So you said that you were 6 when your dad went missing. First, do you have a sense of what the mission was, what the specific date was, and what the mission was?
Yeah. Okay. I was 6 months old, but yeah, um, I do have that information from official documents.
Yeah.
Um, he was on it was a ground attack mission, where they would go after trucks, trains, that sort of thing. The P-47, I don't know if you're familiar with the airplane, but the nickname was the Jug. It's not a sleek looking like the P-51 Mustang. Everybody knows the P-51 Mustang. It,
Yeah.
it was, it looks like, I don't know. It looks barrel chested. It's got eight 50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing, carries bombs and all this. So it was used, although it was used in aerial combat, but and they did escort the bombers and that. It really depended. I found out on what unit you were assigned to,
Uh,
um, because like he was in the 9th Air Force, 8th Air Force. Had I think had most of the bomber escort missions and that sort of thing, and so there were P-47s that were doing that. But the outfit that my dad was in, um, uh, primarily what they were doing was ground attack, interdiction of tanks and trucks and stuff like that.
do you know what the date he went missing is? The specific
Yeah, it was the
date?
27th of May, 1944.
So we can assume this is part of the preparation for D-Day
Yes. Yeah.
then.
Yeah.
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 Do we know whether he was shot down or whether there was a malfunction?
Um, it's assumed that he was shot down, um, because there was anti-aircraft firing, shots fired at the formation. Um, so yeah, we had assumed that he was shot down.
Yeah. So you were 6 months old when your dad went missing. So obviously at that stage you're not aware of what's going on. Do you remember when it was that you began to be aware that, not only that that your dad didn't come home from war, and not just that, but that, you didn't know exactly, where his remains were. How old were you when that really began to register with you?
Well, my mother remarried when I was 4.
Okay.
And so it's hard to really pinpoint that time when I was aware of it. But people were always, I lived with my grandparents
Hmm.
for my mother was young. She always told me she was 20. I checked it out. She wasn't even, she turned, I was born in December. She turned 20 in February. So,
Oh,
she was still 19 when she had me. And, and so she was young. She was working in the factories as a welder. I think, welding aircraft bomb bay doors or
oh,
whatever.
right.
And so she was away at work. So I was with my grandparents, and I was raised by my grandparents for quite a while, and they would, of course, once I got to the age where I could understand what was going on, they would tell me all, about my dad, and you know,
Hmm.
what a great person he was, and people would tell me stories. My uncle John, who was his younger brother, would tell me how my dad never never had to study, uh,
Hmm.
but got straight A's in school, and he
Wow.
was a great violinist. He came in third in the state in some violin contest and all that. There's all these things that came
Yeah.
out, but I couldn't tell you exactly the how old I was when I really came to realize that. But
Yeah.
I would say probably by the time I was 4 or 5, I had a pretty good idea, what
Hmm.
the past had been.
Yeah. Now you said a few minutes ago that, I asked if there was a connection. Your dad was a pilot and you were a pilot, and you said yes, and you said because your dad was a hero,
Mm.
which seems to imply that you felt like there was some kind of standard to live up to or something like that, or how would you describe that? Did you feel like you had some sort of obligation to your dad to, how would you describe that
I
decision
Yeah,
of your mom?
I don't know that I'd use that term. I
Mm.
don't know that I had an obligation. I don't know. I've always been interested in airplanes. So, I mean, I just kind of remember that as a kid, because I built model airplanes, little plastic ones first, and then flying models and all of that. So I wanted to fly. I wanted to be a pilot. I think because people did talk to me a lot about my father,
Yeah.
yeah, and and that was kind of the central thing that kind of came out to me
Mm.
about him was the fact that he had wanted to be a pilot.
Yeah.
Because he, you know, he he didn't go to college at that point. You didn't, during the war like that. A lot of people went from high school right into the aviation cadet program, uh,
Yeah.
and that's. But he had the pass tests and stuff, and he did have the aptitude. Uh, he apparently was quite smart, and
Yeah.
um, so I guess and I guess my mom really, you know, held him up to me as, here's somebody to emulate.
Oh, okay. So that was the question I had. I mean, so your mom remarried when you were 4, but she did still talk about him.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. he, he was he was the love of her life. That there was no doubt about that. And
And that held until well after the war?
yeah, yeah. I mean, in the end, uh, my mom had passed away before the recovery. That's one of the
Hmm.
one of the things that that is saddest for me is that she never knew the final story. And she predeceased him. She was cremated. I actually, my wife and I had considered taking her before the university contacted me. We still thought he was buried in that cemetery, and we were going to take the ashes there and scatter them. Fortunately, we did not do that. And the university, and then the recovery occurred. And when he was buried at Arlington, I had my mom's ashes buried with him, so they're buried together.
Wow.
And for that to happen, she had to have divorced my stepfather, which had happened, several years before she passed away.
And so I'm assuming, just to put together the scenario, I mean, if you could have talked to your mom and said, Mom, we're the idea is that we're going to bring your ashes to Arlington where Dad's remains are, you think she would have given you the green light for that?
Oh, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. The missing in action family members I've spoken with up to now are in the category of folks who, going back to 1951, or in the case of the woman I spoke with yesterday, 1969, they are in the category of family members or loved ones who don't know anything. Other than that, my loved one, for example, flew off such and such aircraft carrier on such and such day and never returned. And that's it. Or my dad or my brother took off from Japan, disappeared somewhere near Russia, and that's all we know. And so, I mean, really basic questions aren't they don't have answers to really basic questions. And I think inevitably what that leads to for them is just kind of these nagging question marks. I mean, just about the basics. Was the plane shot down? Did it crash? Even those kinds of basic questions they don't know. Now you thought that your dad's remains were in that cemetery there in Belgium, if I have it right. Is that
right? Yeah.
So did you not experience that then? I mean, did you, before the recovery program contacted you, did you have that feeling of, I don't know if resolution is the right word, but I mean, was it different for you that you felt like kind of the basics were answered, or did you still feel like, no, some of the basics aren't answered?
Well, yeah, and I was going to mention my mother, I mean, back during the war and immediately afterwards, she didn't really get much information. We didn't find out about the Wingman's report on what happened until quite a while later. But my mother, I mean, she even had questions about, well, maybe he really survived. She actually questioned for a long time whether she had this dream that my father had survived, and so survived the crash.
Do you think that she lived with the idea, I mean, for some period of time that maybe he'll come home?
The thing was kind of disappointing. Excuse me. Is the Army sent an officer to my grandparents' house where we were living. My mom wasn't home. She was at work. The fellow came, he talked to my grandmother who, had come to this country from Hungary. Her English wasn't great, but spoke to her and then briefly, and then he left and never came back. And so we really didn't have any idea of even the cemetery until several years later, when my uncle Lou got, contacted somebody in the Department of Defense and got this photograph of that cemetery.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, my mom definitely went through that period of not knowing anything, basically.
Right. Let's talk about that. When you're contacted, how were you contacted? By telephone, by email
You mean
initially?
the university?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. It was a telephone. It was a telephone call, and we had been away. We came back. There was a message on the answering machine, and it was somebody saying, "We're trying to contact family members of Lieutenant Frank Fazekas, who was killed in World War II." And I had, uh, uh, the internet had been around already and all this, so I had already searched for things on the internet, and there are these people who are hobbyists that try to find information about missing aircrew and post what they find on a
Sure.
website.
Yeah.
And so I'd seen these websites, and I thought, well, okay, this is just somebody looking to get some further information or something. I actually disregarded it for several days. My wife says, "You better listen to that message again." So I listened to it
Hmm.
again, and I go, and it's somebody from the University of Wisconsin, and I go, well, this maybe this is legit. So then
Yeah.
I called, I returned that phone call, and that's how it started.
And
Yeah.
then it started. The day before you hear that first message, in your own mind, I mean, was the story over? You said that you'd looked on the internet. I mean, in your own mind, was the story of your dad and all that? I mean, was it a closed book, or were there still kind of those lingering questions in your mind?
Well, I didn't have any real details, but I didn't think there was. I mean, I didn't think there was any way to get any more information because, like I said, that the wingman, his report was like 4 or 5 sentences, and I didn't find any way. That was one of the things that kind of amazed me once I got working with the university, is they had access to all these documents, and I'm going, wow, where'd this come from? And I guess maybe some of it had been fairly recently declassified because it had been more than 50 years at that point
Yeah.
that since the war.
Wow.
So maybe that's why. But at that point, they had all. I was just surprised at how much information they had on
Wow.
my dad. And when they contacted me, the thing that got me about the phone call, it wasn't just kind of hey, we're interested in. And when I called them back, they said, "We know where your father's plane crashed. His remains were never recovered. We would like to do the recovery. Would you be okay with that?" And I went, I mean, that was just mind blowing to
Yeah.
have that,
Wow.
first of all, to tell me that his remains had never been recovered. Two, that they knew exactly where I mean, pretty much pinpoint where the
Wow.
crash occurred.
Yeah.
And there were some really um, serendipitous stuff that went on that made it possible for them to know that accurately where that airplane went down, because there was a reconnaissance plane, a British reconnaissance picture of that area the next day. You may or may not
Yeah.
know about that. And they weren't looking for him. They were looking for V2 sites or, launch sites and stuff. But here it showed, you could see the crash site. You could see, the field,
Yeah.
how the dirt had been scattered, and you could tell where the airplane came in. So they had a really good idea where it was.
And I think this is a photo where the information is actually up in a corner or something
Yeah.
like that. So So you call back and you hear, we've actually, got some pretty good information. Now, I'm wondering, if something like that happened to me, I think my response would be to put on my walking shoes and go for a long walk. What was your own response?
It was it was just I was amazed that it's just like it was almost shocking to not in a bad way, but it was just like, wow, this is I just and the thing that really, like as I mentioned before, the thing that really bothered me the most was the fact that my mom never,
Hmm.
would never know this, that she
Yeah,
had passed away already, and and uh, so she would never know that.
yeah. Now, the time between that initial contact with the recovery program at the University of Wisconsin, and then of course you've got to go through the process and for the remains to be positively identified, right?
Mhm.
How long was that whole, I mean, I understand, you go to the site, you've got the plane, I think even dog tags, right?
Well, those were, yeah, the dog tags were recovered the second year. Um, let's see, so this would have been what, 2017, I guess. Right. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think that's right.
And my
It
understanding is,
was the second summer that they went back. They found, but the thing was that I mean, there were some glitches initially. They had a. Uh, I, I I don't know how much of the story you know, so if I'm repeating things you already
no,
know, I apologize. But um, I mean, there was an eyewitness. There was
right.
a fellow that was, I think he was 12 years old, 11, 12 years old at the time,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
that went and he saw the plane come down. And so and it was in his field, his family's farm field. So he had a pretty good idea. And then once they did actually start recovering some of the aircraft material, one of the first things they found were one of the machine guns, and they cleaned that off, and the serial number uh, matched exactly to one of the guns on my dad's plane. So
Right.
one, it's the right airplane, and so I mean, it was pretty definite that that was him. Somebody else could have flown his airplane, I suppose, that day, but
Yeah.
that didn't happen, and so
Yeah.
um, the actual DNA, the first summer when I was there, I was allowed to go that first summer when I was there during the recovery. There were some remains that were recovered, and they were sent back. Um, Eventually, they had to go. The the handling of that is kind of, especially, and it's another country,
Mm.
was kind of complicated. So uh, once the remains came back to the U.S. and the DNA was checked, uh, they confirmed that, yeah, that was my dad. And they did take DNA samples from me, my Uncle John, who was my father's full brother,
Right.
younger brother, and from some female relatives as well. So
Right.
they did match,
And so how long was that whole process then from that very first contact to now the government agency responsible for this says, okay, I mean, we know we've got the right plane because of the machine gun, we've got the dog tags. We also have these human remains and we can positively identify those as well. How long was that whole process?
probably close to 2 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now my understanding is that you have the dog tags.
Yes.
Um, That must have been amazing to have those in your hand.
Yeah. Actually, it was just one that was recovered. One of the other things that was amazing to me I mean, I about the time about the time that I was first contacted, there was a recovery of a P-47 in Italy at the same time, or just prior to the initiation of the recovery process on my dad. And this was outside of Bologna. It was done by a group of volunteers and a lot of Italian volunteers that excavated, that provided the big equipment and everything. They excavated this and they found the dog tags of that pilot.
Wow.
And the remains. And so I was pretty hopeful that they would find my dad's dog tags.
Wow.
What was amazing to me was his E&E, his escape and evasion map, which was printed on silk typically,
Right.
survived that fire and 70 plus years underground. And the thing is almost perfectly intact.
That is
It's
incredible.
amazing.
And you have that as well.
I have that as well. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
This may seem like a stupid question, but I mean, where is the dog tag and the map now? Do you have them in a special place? I'm assuming.
Yeah, I have it with when he was buried. You know, they typically present you with the flag, the burial flag, and so I have it all with that. Yeah.
How it's probably an unanswerable question and maybe a stupid one, but I mean, how much of a difference does that make to you to have the map that your dad held, to have the dog tag that your dad wore? I mean, now to have that in your home, how much of a difference does that make?
Oh yeah, that's very important to me.
Yeah.
I had things were returned when he was killed. There were things that were I do have things from my father, and of course I treasure them. I had a couple of pairs of his wings. Back in those days, they were solid sterling silver,
Mm.
and you know the one set of wings is engraved with his name in the back. My mom probably had, I'm sure had that done. And then I have another set that I actually had made into a bracelet. It's kind of, I mean, it's a huge, it's a pretty big thing. But and I have a 50 caliber machine gun bullet that has no powder in it. You can actually pull the bullet off the cartridge, and that I assume came from that. But there were things, I have his ID card, so I have some of those things. Some things, unfortunately, kind of disappeared. Actually, back then, things were much looser in the military back then than they are now. They actually returned my father's 45 caliber Colt 45, his automatic, his sidearm. And my mom had it, and my Uncle John, her brother, said, "Oh, you can't have this with Frank Jr. around, and it's just a kid. You can't have." So he says, "I'll take it for safekeeping," and then he did something with it, sold it, gave it away. I don't know what he did with it.
Yeah.
Caused a big rift between my mom and her brother, but along with some other issues, but that's family stuff, I guess.
Yeah. But you do have this collection.
Right.
Now my understanding, or you said a minute ago that you visited the site, and you visited the site the first year. There were 2 years, of course you're in a part of the world where fall, spring, winter, I think you're pretty limited in what you can do. So it's pretty much 2 summers, right? I think is what we're talking about.
Right. Yeah.
Um, You were
It had
there.
to be dry. Yeah.
Yes,
The weather. Yeah.
you were there for the first summer. Um, and my understanding is that you were given some time alone there at the site, if that's right. Are you willing to share a little bit about what that was like?
Yeah. It was hard to describe because,
Hmm.
again, what and I've tried to I would try to explain this to people, and I hope that this comes across the way I mean it.
Hmm.
Um, I think that the grief, the sense of loss that people have when they lose a loved one is wrapped up in the relationship that they had with that person.
Hmm.
I was 6 months old. I have no recollection of my father. We never played ball. He didn't teach me to drive a car. We never had any of that.
Sure.
So what I was feeling was more for my mom,
Hmm.
because she was the person that I did have that kind of relationship with, and she was gone, and she was gone before we knew what happened. And
Hmm.
I'm sorry to keep bringing this issue back, but that to me is like a very central issue. And I felt great sadness
Hmm.
that she didn't know
Yeah.
what was going on.
Sure. Which I'm imagining then makes, first of all, the sense of relief all the greater that her ashes weren't spread
Yes.
at the
Yeah.
cemetery in Belgium,
Yeah.
and also makes that what you were able to do at Arlington all the more significant,
Right. Right.
right? To the extent you were able to patch that up. Yeah. Tell me a little bit about the team from the university on the ground. I've talked to a number of these folks, and I mean, from what I've heard, I've been very, very impressed. Um, just by this project and by the quality of the folks who are involved in it. What was your sense of it? Not only being there in that place, but being among these folks who were involved in this project. My understanding, on a volunteer basis. I mean,
Mhm.
this is not what their resume says. Is this what they do for a living? I think they're doing this as volunteers. What was your impression of the crew on the ground?
Well, I was amazed at how much, I don't know, horsepower or whatever you want to call it, that they brought to bear on this. They had all these people uh, who highly educated, but then there were also the students, and this everybody was just so um, I don't know, welcoming, so thoughtful about my feelings of what was going on, and they just put in so much effort. This is not it's not Indiana Jones, kind of glory. It's digging, bringing buckets of dirt up, climbing out of the hole with buckets of dirt and dumping the bucket and going down and getting another bucket, and then sifting through this stuff and through a fine mesh. Um, it's tedious work, and everybody was just happy to do it, and so it's quite amazing to see it done, see people devote themselves to it.
Yeah, wow. It is an amazing story. And I was just thinking, I mean, the origins of the story is, the origin of the story is a huge tragedy, which is the Second World War. And then related to that tragedy is what happens to your dad. But it does seem to be one of those cases where, what's the right way of putting it, that in a sense, from this tragedy has sprung kind of this, this inspiring story where, strangers meet up and they're collaborating and they have this sense of common mission and common purpose, to accomplish something.
It's interesting. It's interesting that you say that, because at the burial at Arlington, I did get up and give somewhat of a eulogy, actually a little talk, and that was one of the things that I said. Out of all of, as terrible as this was for my mom and all, I said, I now have a friend in Belgium that she came and she acted as the translator, because most of the people from the university didn't speak French, and she had helped them all. Danielle had helped them all through, even before I got involved with it, and so I have this, and I said, and now I have these friends at University of Wisconsin, and I've been up there, and even the young lady from AP that did the story, I just we went out and I met her, and we're Facebook friends, and we email back and forth, and it's so in that sense, yeah, it's been a great experience from the point of seeing how much people care to do this for somebody else.
Yeah. Yeah. And, and along with that, I mean, I wanted to talk to you because I wanted to hear your story. I've heard a lot about, about the story, but I wanted to hear from you. And also, you probably know the number. Since the Second World War, so Second World War, Korea, Vietnam, primarily, those three, and then there are missing associated with the Cold War. I mean, the rough number is 80,000 still accounted missing. There are a lot of folks out there who feel discouraged, who understandably feel bitter, who perhaps have given up. And so, among the reasons I wanted to talk with you was, to maybe give others a little encouragement, that there are folks out there who are very diligent and committed, looking for these folks. And if you've got 80,000 missing, I mean, that's a big number. And, and so that big number is what it is. But there are folks out there who are doing this work, and you benefited from it. And so and I know that others are in the process of have benefited from that, and are in the process of benefiting from it, and will benefit from it. So I guess, that's part of my hope as well, that folks will hear your story and feel encouraged, that the work is continuing.
Yeah, it's my understanding that this program, or that the recovery of my dad's remains, was kind of a pilot program where DPAA was reaching out to civilian institutions for assistance, because, like you say, 80,000 people, and a government agency, military Department of Defense agency like this doesn't have the manpower to do that in any kind of reasonable amount of time.
Yeah.
So by reaching out to these civilian universities and leveraging, especially like, these archaeology students, and you're giving them some practical experience, and in return, it's really a win-win situation. If this program expands, that'd be great because it will leverage this number of students and faculty members that are willing to go out and assist in doing the manpower, the grunt work, if you will, of these recoveries.
Yeah, well, I share your hope. And, you know, as we're talking in the late summer of 2020, and it's no secret that, you know, the American public is a pretty divided public. But I think of all the things that, I mean, most people can still agree to. I think,
Yeah.
you know, pretty much everyone would agree that this is important, worthwhile work that should be done. And that's kind of how I see it, as, you know, among other reasons to promote this, to make this kind of work better known, is that it is something that I think that folks still can rally around and
Unifying, yeah.
that
Yeah.
sense of purpose.
It's my understanding. I mean, I think our country is the only one that really puts this much effort into this kind of recovery.
I think you're right. I think you're right. And I think that's
I
something to be proud of.
I have, as you know, as people find out my dad's story, people that I know and have associated with, I've come to meet other people that have similar situations. I met a fella whose father was a Luftwaffe pilot in World War II. And he had a similar, we've kind of talked on the phone, and he had a kind of a similar situation. And they don't, I mean, they did recover his dad's remains, but they're not cared for in the same degree, in the same fashion that, you know, he basically had to climb over some wall to get into the cemetery, and it wasn't well kept, and just, and I don't mean it to disparage, you know, another country or anything like that. I'm just saying that we really, in this country, put a lot of stock in doing this recovery and treating things with honor, you know, people.
I think that's right. My understanding is that that's correct. That relative, you know, folks who have been at it for years, you know, will feel discouraged, and that's perfectly understandable. It's true at the same time that relative to, I think, every other country, this one does put forth the most effort. And, you know, that's something to remember, and that's something I think to be proud of as an American.
Absolutely.